I'd always been interested about John the 23rd and the Council. About 10 years ago, when they were celebrating the 40th anniversary of Vatican II, I was being trotted out across parishes and deaneries to talk about this topic, even though my initial postgraduate degree was in local church history. So people were calling me an expert on John and the Council, when in fact I wasn't. But I had enough of an interest as an historian to pursue whatever people wanted me to do. It was only later on when Archbishop Hart asked me to consider doing doctoral studies and to teach at Catholic Theological College that I was asked, well, what's going to be your topic now? And I was given some advice to go from local Melbourne Australian church history to some of the big global questions associated with the Vatican Council, and in particular with the 20th century of great change in the church and in the world. Most historians and theologians say that shelves bulge with books on Vatican II and will continue to be the case. I guess the thing that makes this book unique is that it gives a much wider historical perspective. It doesn't look at just the council, the documents, the participants, the debates and the factions that emerged in the church, but it gives a much wider historical view in terms of Pope John as an historian, Pope John as the great thinker reflecting on change and interpreting change, and this whole connection between the Council of Trent that he studied and the Second Vatican Council that he called. It's a much wider historical perspective, especially given the fact that at the time of Vatican II, people were running around saying it's the end of the Tridentine era, which was very correct in many respects. It was the end of a particular style of polemical sort of Catholicism. But rather than being the end of the Tridentine era, in fact, we're seeing Pope John the great interpreter of Trent, the great pastoral reflection of Trent. And that gave him the language and the framework to call Vatican II. So I think it's in that context that this contribution gives a much wider historical perspective to Pope John as an historian, to his wide thinking about history, and in particular the relationship between Trent and Vatican II, as opposed to the axe cutting them both and separating them. In fact, this period, this study, brings the two together in terms of Pope John's historical imagination. One of the things is the Council began at a time of great historical flux, a time of enormous change in the 20th century. After the Second World War, the great movement of times and places of the 50s and the 60s. We remember them as times of political upheaval, the sexual revolution, the feminist revolution, the Cold War, Vietnam War, John F. Kennedy in the White House, the end of colonialism, great movements and changes. And I guess the Council did its best in terms of trying to address that change, but since then, the 50 years since the Council, the Church and the world have changed even more. So I guess the Council was a bit of an opening. It was giving us a key, a way to interpret change, a way to engage with the prevailing questions of the time. It's actually the ongoing debate between the relationship between faith and history, faith and culture. And I think that's the great dialogue that Pope John began to talk about, and Pope Paul VI, who completed the Council, that was his great theme in terms of dialogue within the Church, dialogue between Christians, but then again, dialogue between the Church and the world. And that's where we get the great document Gaudium et Spes. Well, Pope Benedict's in a unique position, having been present at the Council. The late Pope John Paul II was a Council father. He was a very young bishop at Vatican II. Joseph Ratzinger was an even younger theological advisor to Cardinal Fring. So he was present at that time. But again, the Church and the world of the 60s is very different to the Church and the world of today. So I guess Pope Benedict has the challenge of helping the Church, like Pope John, to interpret change, to continue that path of aggiornamento, of updating and renewal for the Church, but also to keep alive the great themes of dialogue, of situating faith and the political, social, cultural realities, the vastly changing realities of the world today.